Hey, we've been talking about the kingdom, and it's been good. We started off kind of defining the kingdom, that the kingdom is the rule and reign of God in our here and now, that it affects our everyday reality. Week 2, we stepped into the understanding that the word is not just the word of the kingdom. The good news of the kingdom is not just a spoken word. It's not just a declared word. It's a word that comes with power. It's married with action. The declaration has a demonstration to it. That is the nature of the kingdom. We saw that in the life of Jesus. Week 3, we continue to talk about how we are not the kingdom, right? We are not the seed that is sown. The message of the kingdom is not us. We are not the plant. We don't bear the fruit, but we can cultivate and make space in our lives so that the kingdom has a beautiful and fertile ground for us to carry the kingdom, that we live in this symbiotic relationship where we carry the seed and the message of the kingdom, and when it bears fruit, it is bigger than we could have ever imagined. And today, I want to turn our attention to more of our role. So we understand the kingdom. We're making space for the kingdom. We're cultivating that in our life. And now we have to understand our role in the kingdom. We have to understand the authority and the permission that has been given. Now, if we've hung out for a while, you know that I grew up in the church. My dad's a Baptist pastor, and for the first 11 years of his pastoral ministry, we were in a very small country church in Lawton, Michigan. It was a great farming town. And there was about 30 people in the church, and we did explode at about 50 people, but we got a little crazy there. And it was a good life, though. I mean, there were ups and downs. We had the downside, which was a lot of the potlucks at times, and didn't know why my dad was making me be so overly appreciative for some of those ladies' pies, but I get it now. And there were other things that were really, really good about it as well. Like, I've mentioned it before, but I used to have sleepovers in the church. Like, everybody else just had to have them at their house, but like, we rolled out the AV cart, right? We rented our favorite 90s movie, popped it in the VHS player, sat back with a 3-liter of orange Faygo pop, dollar store candy, and sugared ourselves within an inch of our life. It was beautiful. Right? And after a while, it got to the point where my dad he was like, you know what, I'm tired of like loaning you my key or letting you into the church, so why don't you just have a key? Like, you can just have a key. Now, this was a little bit down the line. I think I was like 11 or 12, but I got my first key to the church at 11 or 12. I don't even think anybody here can say that, right? So it was down the line. I got my first key to the church at 11 or 12, and I was feeling pretty good about it. I was feeling pretty empowered, like I had a whole bunch of freedom because I could just go in and out whenever I wanted to. When I was 5, we started like ringing. We had an old bell, like with the big rope on it, and it was a huge rope. And Luther Sly would pull that bell every single week. And you know, with a name like Luther Sly, you belong on bell ringing, right? So Luther Sly would pull the bell, the rope, and I would raise up with it, and he'd pull me back down to the ground, and I'd raise back up, and it was my favorite part of every Sunday. But as I got older and as I got that key, I started exploring more, and I got curious. I was like, where does that rope go? So we got up in the attic with my friends, and we're like finding the bell tower. Turns out there's squirrels that live in there too. And it was just an amazing, like, there was a whole lot of exploration that happened, and it was like this amazing sense of freedom that came along with being given the keys to the church. But what also came along with it was quite a bit of responsibility. So the building itself was about 150-ish years old, I think by now. It was an old church. And the basement was 150 years old, and that plumbing at best was from like the 1950s, right? And it was just old, and there were a lot of issues. And so sometimes my friends and I, as we got older, we went downstairs into the basement to the sofas that were kept in like our youth space, and we slept on the sofas, and a lot of things would happen in the basement, and one of those things was pipes would leak. And we knew this was a common occurrence, but I remember one morning waking up with my friends, and we heard some trickling, so we were like, what's going on? So we stepped off the couch and stepped into an inch of water on the floor. Well, we knew what to do. This was not the first time this had happened, so I was like, okay, guys, I'll go get the buckets. You guys get the mops and the other buckets, and we'll find the towels, and we'll just get it all. And we did that at 3 in the morning. We went back to sleep. My dad didn't have to worry about it. We just took care of it, and then we would tell him in the morning, hey, 3 o'clock last night, we had to mop up the floor. It was just a mess. You might want to have somebody come out and look at that again. And that's how it went. So we had a lot of fun, but also there was a lot of responsibility that came along with it. Another fun thing that was there in the understanding of this is that I had a lot of friends come into the church with me because of that. Like, I literally got to open the doors of the church to my friends who don't go to church. And that was a lot of fun. We had a lot of sometimes middle of the night significant conversations because I had been given the keys to the church. Now, there's a principle in ministry and in leadership in general. It's called the keychain principle. And there's this understanding of giving away your keys. And sometimes that can be a literal giving away of the keys, like we give away a key to the building so that people can get in and do what they need to do. But there's also this metaphorical understanding of giving away keys, and that just represents significant responsibility. Because as a leader, if I'm giving away a key to the church, a physical, literal key, it comes with some ramifications. Right? What it's saying is that I'm still in charge, like I'm still responsible for what happens in this space, but I'm entrusting you to be able to open it up and do what God has called you to do. Right? And that is great, but it's also messy. Because once I started giving away my keys, literally and figuratively, giving away significant ministry responsibility, I had to risk a little bit. I had to understand that there were going to be people who don't do things with the same approach that I have, or they don't do things in the same way, or maybe they're not as good at it, or worse yet for me, what if they're way better at it, right? And giving away keys came with a lot of risk. But without it, people couldn't step in and do the things they needed to do. Now, if you're a parent or you are a business owner or a manager, you know what it's like to give away responsibility. I have a picture of Asa a couple of years ago we're going to put up there. And this was our lawn back in Michigan, and it was spring, and the grass was just like so much rain, it just grows like crazy in the spring. And I get pretty particular about the lines in my grass. I don't know if there's anybody else out there, but I have a pattern and I have lines, and I became the butt of many jokes, right? Oh, the lines are just a little bit off. Don't mess with Dad. And so I had this pattern. We would do lengthwise one week, widthwise the next week, diagonal the following. You guys with me, right? Yeah, why you do that? So you don't get the ruts in the yard. We all know this. We know this. And you keep the lines straight. But there comes a time when I have to teach my son how to mow the grass. And in doing so, I have to entrust him with the responsibility of mowing the lawn. And when he does, it's not going to turn out exactly the same way that maybe I would do it. And I remember when we started having these conversations, he was like, I'm not doing it. You're way too weird about lines. I was like, I get that. What if we don't worry about the lines? Which was really hard to say, just confession moment. Like, it was really hard to say, just forget about the lines. Let's just worry about getting the grass. And maybe not all of it. Like, it's okay if you miss a couple patches, just mow the lawn. He's like, well, I think I can do that then. And it was a risk because, number one, the lawnmower is a big responsibility. There's like whirling blades and certain risk of death and all of that. And so he's pushing it, and he actually does a really good job, and he gets done, and we're able to celebrate it. But some of the things that limited him from doing that was, number one, my understanding of giving away and understanding that like the lines aren't going to be the same. His fear of being paralyzed with fear of, I don't want to do this because like if I don't get the lines right, Dad's going to be upset. No, I'm not going to be upset. I trust you with this. So I give away the responsibility. Now, again, if you're a parent or a manager or anything, you've been on the giving end of that. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of that as well, and you've felt the fear of maybe getting it right the first time. It doesn't matter what your Enneagram number is or what your personality type is. Like, there is a response to risk that we all have. Some of us, it's like this paralyzing fear of getting it right the first time, or fear of failure, or we just avoid it because that feels like a lot of pressure, so I'm just going to bow out, or I'll push it off until I feel like I can get it right. Right? These are all responses to being given responsibility. But we can't just be given responsibility. We also have to be given permission, because one of the things that helps with that fear of failure is permission to fail. Like, what if somebody tells you the difference between doing it and not doing it is just you have permission to not do it well? Like, you have permission to go outside the lines. You have permission to get a little messy. It's okay if you don't get all the grass. I think in our culture we have a little bit of a lack of permission giving. Right? Like, there's this understanding that if I give permission to somebody else to do what I'm doing, then I'm not as significant as I could be. Or if I give them permission, what if they overshadow me? Or what if they do it better than me? Or what if, and there's all sorts of what ifs. And our whole upward mobility, our whole promotion, our whole career advancement hinges on me doing it better than somebody else. And so this competitive nature and this competitive spirit in our culture kind of kills the permission giving and multiplication that could happen. I am so thankful that is not how it works in the kingdom. Let's take a look. We're going to go today to Matthew chapter 16. We've been spending a lot of time in the Gospels. That's where we find Jesus. So let's go to Matthew chapter 16. We're going to be in verses 13 through 19. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So we have the keys coming back up, friends. We have the keys. Now, this passage is, we kind of started right in the middle of the story. There's a passage before this where the Pharisees are testing Jesus, and they're asking for signs, even though Jesus has already performed just a massive amount of undeniable signs, yet the Pharisees ask for more signs. And then they leave, and Matthew, the author of this, does something interesting. He links two stories together, and he does that for a purpose. What we're going to find is that Matthew contrasts the Pharisees' desires for control and limiting people who come into the kingdom with Jesus' response to giving away the keys of the kingdom. And that's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves after this Pharisee grilling of Jesus, and then Jesus warns his followers to be careful of the teachings and the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then instead of manipulating anything, Jesus just has this humble moment of saying, "Who do you say I am? This is who the crowd says he is, but who do you say I am?" And that's when Peter speaks up. You see, the other apostles, they were able to answer what others say of him. They knew his reputation, but Peter is the first one that speaks up, and he says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Now, there's something important going on here, because Peter doesn't even understand the depth of the answer that he just gave. Everybody else in the crew had kind of been answering, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still other Jeremiah or one of the prophets, and they're just kind of repeating what other people say. But Peter enters in boldly with a beautiful confession that you are not just prophet. You are not just an archetypal presence of somebody that came before us representing a significant person in our culture. You are the true Messiah. You are the Son of the living God. Now, this is significant not only because of what Peter says, but because Peter actually has no idea what he's actually saying. Peter hits the nail on the head. He's 100% right in his confession of Jesus, but he has no clue what he says. And you can see that as it follows. Peter is one of those guys. He's really bold. He's a fiery presence. And that's really good sometimes, because he's going to speak up and he's going to get the confession right. And then moments later, he's going to put his foot in his mouth and he's going to need to be rebuked by Jesus. Like, that's the kind of guy Peter is. Peter's a little bit of a messy guy. But in this moment, he gets it right even more than he understands. And you can see from the rest of the Gospels and even until Jesus is resurrected, the disciples don't really understand the fullness of Jesus as Messiah and as the Son of God. And then it's being developed even in the understanding of the early church. But for some reason, Peter is bold and he gets it right. In fact, he gets it so right, it merits a specific response from Jesus. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood." Right? Like, you don't understand what you just said. What was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Now, Jesus is having a little fun with some name play here because Peter and rock are very similar in their sound. And so Jesus uses a little bit of word play, and that's fun and all that. But what's really interesting here is Jesus is actually giving Peter a new name. He names Peter Rock. Maybe not the most endearing name, right? I was in middle school with a guy, and I actually don't remember his real name because everybody called him Rocks. And he was a big dude, right? He was a wrestler. It was beyond muscly for his age, but he got the name Rocks because his teacher said he was dumber than a box of rocks, and that just kind of stuck. So, it's not like necessarily the most endearing name out there, but it's the name that Jesus gives. And that's significant because if you trace back through Scripture, you see that every person that God names or renames is given a different future. They're given something different. They are defined differently, and their purpose and their assignment is changed. So we can go all the way back to Adam. We see God name Adam, and what he's doing is he's giving Adam an assignment. He's giving Adam significance and function and purpose. And then Adam names Eve, giving her function and purpose. We move down to Abram, and God calls Abram and gives him the H from Yahweh as he becomes Abraham. And then Sarah gets the H from Yahweh as well, and she becomes Sarah, which is not that big of a change, but she gets another letter, so that's cool. And it changes their function. Right? It changes who they are, and this renaming is a significant thing. And you can track that on throughout Scripture. And so here, it's a very big deal that Jesus names Peter Rock. It's giving Peter a new function. It's asking Peter to see himself in a different light. And this is the light that he's asking Peter to see him. On this rock, right, on you, Peter, I will build my church. Now, church is not a building. He's not talking about architectural drawings and laying a good foundation on the bedrock, although that's kind of in the metaphor. He's talking about his people. The term ecclesia that we get our word church from actually means the people of God. Not a building, not a specific location, but a people. And so Jesus says, now you are rock, and I will build my church on you. I will have my people founded on you. Now, Jesus is, in one sense, giving Peter a very special role in the church, and history tells us that. History tells us, you can look through even the book of Acts and into the epistles, the letters of the Bible, and you can see that Peter is given a prominent place in the church. He's the head of the people. He's had to make some hard decisions, and he is in the thick of it. He is over the church of Jerusalem at first, and history even tells us that in many ways he's looked at as the first church father. Even Catholicism gets its apostolic succession from Peter. They trace all of their lineage back, one leader to the next leader, to the next leader, to the next leader, to Peter. So Peter is, in this sense, given a very real and active function, but there's a why behind it. Why is Peter given this role? For most of it, Peter actually made more mistakes than the other disciples. If Peter would have just stayed quieter, he probably wouldn't have gotten in much trouble. Peter got rebuked so many times. Do you want us to call fire down, Lord? You don't know what you're saying, right, Peter? Like, shut up. Stop talking. But it's because of his boldness that he speaks up and he confesses Jesus as Messiah, as Son of the living God. And it's this confession that earns Peter a new name. So when Jesus says, you are a rock, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, he is in one sense, in a very real sense, talking about the specific person of Peter, but he's also talking about the type of person Peter is. The type of person who confesses Jesus as Messiah. And that's a very important thing. So Jesus is saying, you are getting a new name, you're getting a new function, and it's because of your confession of me. You are rock because you are bold and you confessed who I am. And because of this, we can move on. You are Peter, I will build my church, gates of Hades will not overcome, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, Jesus is not talking about a literal key, but they would have understood keys very literally. Now, they had plenty of time to figure out metalworking, and their locks were very intricate, and you can find pictures of these really cool key rings that Romans would carry around, and they would unlock their houses, and you just kind of, you bend your finger and twist, like, I want one of those. But the keys of the kingdom were bigger than a house key, because the keys of the kingdom were the biggest keys you would find in the kingdom. They unlocked the city gates. It wasn't just a palace, it wasn't just a home, it was the massive protective gates of the city. That's what the kingdom keys would unlock. Now, the keys belonged to only one person, they belonged to the king. The king was in charge of the kingdom, they were his keys, and he was over all. But what we find is we find a precedence, especially in Scripture. We could go to Isaiah 22:22, and we see that the king actually gives his keys away to a steward. So the king owned the keys, but the king didn't carry the keys. The king had all authority, but he gave the keys to a steward to be able to unlock the kingdom. And this steward had the permission and the authority to open the gates to whomever he felt should come in. And he did so under the full authority of the king. So the king didn't have to make all those decisions. The king gives away the keys of the kingdom, the gates keys, to a steward, and the steward is the one who opens the gates. That is what's happening right here. Jesus is giving away the metaphorical keys of the kingdom. He is giving them to Peter because of his confession and stewarding them. And here's the beautiful thing. Jesus gives Peter permission to steward the kingdom. And all that it took was a simple confession. Peter is given permission to steward the kingdom. What usually the king does, now Peter gets to do it. And now we're not just talking about a kingdom of earth, we are talking about the kingdom of heaven. And this is very significant because it comes not just with freedoms and excitement and a certain amount of prestige, it comes with massive responsibility. In fact, we can read on, I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. You see, when the keys are given away to the steward, it comes with a certain amount of responsibility. These decisions need to be made. And the terms loosing and binding may not mean a whole lot to us. And if you spend any time in the church, maybe you've been in some churches where people are binding and loosing spiritual forces or demonic presence. I've heard it used that way. That's actually not what this is talking about. In fact, while loosing and binding may not make a ton of sense to us, it actually made a ton of sense to Jesus' original hearers. Loosing and binding was a very common rabbinical term. Rabbis used it all the time. In fact, it was the rabbi's prerogative what they would bind and what they would loose. And binding pretty much just equals declaring something permissible. Declaring something off limits or not allowed. And loosing meant to declare something allowed. So to bind something was to prohibit it, and to loose something was to allow it. And when Jesus gives Peter permission to steward the kingdom, he gives him permission to say, this is allowed in the kingdom, and this is not allowed in the kingdom. Now, Peter doesn't just get to do these all on his own. He doesn't get to make things up willy-nilly just on his whims and bend the purposes of the kingdom to his own will. Peter is charged and given permission to steward the kingdom, not to own the kingdom. You see, the kingdom still belongs to Jesus, and Jesus is still the prime authority in the kingdom. So what is allowed is actually based on who Jesus is. And Peter is given permission to look at the person of Jesus and to make decisions on behalf of the kingdom. Peter is given the keys of the kingdom to open up the gates to people who normally would not have the gates opened up. And right now, he's specifically looking back at the Pharisees. In fact, we have William Barclay says this. In contrast to those who are shutting people out of God's kingdom, those who confess Jesus as Christ can usher people in. Let's read that one more time. In contrast to those shutting people out of God's kingdom, those who confess Jesus as Christ can usher people in. Friends, we have a lot of the church right now that's in a little bit of a hard spot. It's in a hard spot because for some reason we feel like it's been our job to protect the kingdom and to make sure that the wrong people don't get in. And so we've been taking these keys as those who confess Jesus as both Messiah and Son of the living God, and we've used it to lock the doors. That is not in line with the King's desires. That is not the way of Jesus. That is us taking the keys of the kingdom and using the message of the kingdom for our own desires and to protect ourselves and to be self-serving. That is not the purpose of being given keys. The church has locked the gates, but that's not the purpose of the keys. The only purpose of the keys is so that the steward can open the gates. And so we see it throughout Peter's life. We get into the early church, and he gets the keys of the kingdom, and he starts making these decisions. And one of the first big decisions he has to do is he allows the Gentiles in. Big deal. They were not allowed in synagogue. They were not allowed to worship in the temple. They were unclean, and they were meant to be kept out. And Jesus confronts Peter, and he says, no, fling those gates wide open and let the Gentiles in. Because now my family is based on who follows me and not on a religious practice. So open up those gates. And Peter opens up the gates. And the Gentiles are allowed in the church. And then Peter has to start binding and loosing things, and it deals with things like circumcision in the church and Jewish practices in the church and baptism and washing of hands and ritual purification ceremonies. And Peter says, all of that's past. It is only the grace of God now, in faith in Jesus alone, that saves us. Peter starts saying, this is permissible. You don't have to do that anymore. That's what it looks like to truly open up the kingdom to people. It's not Peter standing at the pearly gates the way that somehow Hollywood has made it. This is not an afterlife thing. Peter is not waiting up at pearly gates to welcome you into eternity. Peter's job, and consequently your and my job as confessors of Jesus, is to stand at the gates now, opening them up to people. That there is a kingdom to be entered, and it will remain closed unless you and I take the keys that we have been given and we unlock the gates and we fling them open. We fling them open with the declared and demonstrated message of Jesus. We fling them open with a life that is cultivated to bring the presence of God in our lives in every single place we walk. We fling wide the gates of the kingdom when we understand that the kingdom is meant to be experienced now, in our here and now. It affects our everyday reality. So it's not just for Peter. Here's the truth. You and I, we have been given permission to steward the kingdom. And it's going to get a little messy. Once we start moving out into this and we start understanding the permission that we've been given to steward the kingdom, it gets a little messy. Again, you can look back to the early church. Things got messy. There were accusations of heresy. Councils had to be called. People got in bitter arguments about it, and sometimes partnerships split. Sometimes people literally died because things got so messy. Ananias and Sapphira fell dead at the apostles' feet, and everybody scattered because they were afraid of the disciples. Things got messy. But the good news is Jesus is not afraid of the mess. He's not worried about the risks that we take. He's not worried about the lines being straight or every patch of grass being mowed. He knows you, and the only thing that he cares about is that you confess him as Lord and Savior of your life. And then you are given keys. And these are the keys to the gate of the kingdom that we need to fling wide open. We need to fling them wide open to our neighbors. We need to fling them wide open to our families, to our kids, and to our friends. We need to fling them wide open to our coworkers, to the places that we hang out, the places that we live, the places that we work, and the places that we play. We have to fling wide the gates of the kingdom. It is our responsibility. It is not to shut them. It is to open them up and to welcome people in. That is who we are. And that is what we do. So look at me. You and I carry the keys of the kingdom. We didn't earn them. We simply confessed Jesus, and maybe sometimes we don't even understand the level of our confession. But you weren't given them to close gates. You were given them to open gates. Be a way maker. Be a way opener. Be somebody who has the way to eternal life, not the one who closes it on somebody else and is waiting for them to clean up their act before they can get it right. Because the gospel is, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Let people belong before they believe. Let people belong before they start becoming. Let people taste and see that the Lord is good. And remember that we are carriers of the kingdom. I'm excited to talk about this next week. I'm excited to talk about where God is leading us. And I imagine that as we take all of this incredibly seriously, that things will get chaotic and they will get messy. We won't always know what we're doing, so I just want to put a little disclaimer there. We won't always know what we are doing. It won't always be neat and tidy, but we are willing to step out and to risk and to do poorly until we can learn to do well. And I imagine if we do that, it'll work out. It'll work out well. And I think lives will be changed. I think people will see hope. And I think the very real darkness that we sense in our city of addiction and brokenness, broken relationships, broken identities, those things get freed up. We see that darkness pushed back and strongholds broken. Let's pray.